Section 13 of Cleek of Scotland Yard by Thomas W. Hanshew. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. "Yes, a very, very clever scheme indeed, Miss Renfrew," agreed Cleek. "Laid with great cunning and carried out with extreme carefulness, as witness the man's coming here and getting appointed constable and biding his time, and the woman serving as cook for 6 months to get the entrée to the house and to be ready to assist when the time of action came round. I don't think I had the least inkling of the truth until I entered this house and saw that woman. She had done her best to pad herself to an unwieldy size and to blanch portions of her hair, but she couldn't quite make her face appear old without betraying the fact that it was painted, and hers is one of those peculiarly pretty faces that one never forgets when one has ever seen it. I knew her the instant I entered the house, and remembering the Chanticleer dress with its foul-foot boots, I guessed at once what those marks would prove to be when I came to investigate them. She must have stamped on the ground with all her might to sink the marks in so deeply, but she meant to make sure of the claws and the exaggerated scales on the toes, leaving their imprint. I was certain that we should find that dress and those boots among her effects, and Mr. Narkom did. What I wrote on that pretended telegram was for him to slip away into the house proper and search every trunk and cupboard for them. Pardon? No, I don't think they really had any idea of incriminating Sir Ralph Droger. That thought came into the fellow's mind when you stepped out and caught him stealing away after the murder had been committed. No doubt he, like you, had seen Sir Ralph practising for the sports, and he simply made capital of it. The main idea was to kill his father and to destroy the will, and, of course, when it became apparent that the old gentleman had died intestate, even a discarded son must inherit. Where he made his blunder, however, was in his haste to practise his ventriloquial accomplishment, to prevent your going into the round house and discovering that his father was already dead. He ought to have waited until you had spoken, so that it would appear natural for the old man to know, without turning, who it was that had opened the door. That is what put me on the track of him. Until that moment I hadn't the slightest suspicion where he was, nor under what guise he was hiding. Of course, I had a vague suspicion, even before I came and saw her, that the cook was in it. Her readiness in inventing a fictitious gipsy with a bear's muzzle, coupled with what Nippers had told me of the animal marks she had pointed out, looked a bit fishy. But until I actually met her, nothing really tangible began to take shape in my thoughts. That's all, I think. And now, good night and good luck to you, Miss Renfrew. The riddle is solved, and Mr. Narkom and I must be getting back to the wilderness and to our ground-floor beds in the Hotel of the Beautiful Stars." Here, as if some spirit of nervous unrest had suddenly beset him, he turned round on his heel, motioned the superintendent to follow, and, brushing by the awed and staring Mr. Ephraim Nippers, whisked open the door and passed briskly out into the hush and darkness of the night. The footpath which led through the grounds to the gate and thence to the long, lonely way back to Dollops and the caravan lay before him. He swung into it with a curious sort of energy, and forged away from the house at such speed that Narkom's short, fat legs were hard put to it to catch up with him before he came to the path's end.
"My dear chap, are you going into training for a match with that Sir Ralph What's-his-name of whom Miss Renfrew spoke?"
he wheezed when he finally overtook him.
"You long, lean beggars are the very old boy for covering the ground. But wait until you get to be my age, by James!"
"Perhaps I shan't. Perhaps they won't let me," threw back Cleek, in a voice curiously blurred, as if he spoke with his teeth hard shut. "Donkeys do die, you know. That little bit of tommy-rot about the absence of their dead bodies to the contrary."
"Meaning what, old chap?"
that I've been as big an ass as any of the thistle-eating kind that ever walked. Gad, such an indiscretion, such an example of pure brainlessness. And the worst of it is that it's all due to my own wretched vanity, my own miserable weakness for the theatrical and the spectacular. It came to me suddenly while I was standing there explaining things to Miss Renfrew, and I could have kicked myself for my folly."
"Folly? What folly?"
"What folly? What? Good heavens, man, use your wits! Isn't it enough for me to be a blockhead without you entering the lists along with me?" said Cleek, irritably. "Oh, no, forgive that, dear friend. My nerves were speaking, not my heart. But in moments like this, when we had built a safe bridge and my own stupidity has hacked it down, I tell you I could kick myself. Didn't you hear? Didn't you see?"
"I saw that for some special reason you were suddenly obsessed with a desire to get out of the house in the midst of your talking with Miss Renfrew, if that's what you refer to, is it?"
"Not altogether. It's part of it, however, but not the worst part, unfortunately. It was at that moment then the recollection of my indiscretion came to me, and I realized what a dolt I had been, how completely I had destroyed our splendid security, wrecked what little still remains of this glorious holiday, when I couldn't let George Headland have the centre of the stage, but needs must come in like the hero of a melodrama and announce myself as Cleek. To Nosworth and his wife, to Nippers, to all that gaping crowd. You remember that incident, surely?"
"Yes, of course I do. But what of it?"
"What of it? Man alive, with a chap like that Nippers, how long do you suppose it will remain a secret that Cleek is in Yorkshire, in the West Riding of it, in this particular locality, travelling about with Mr. Maverick Narkom in a caravan? A caravan that can't cover 5 miles of country in the time a train or a motor car is able to get over 50.
"Good lad, I never thought of that. But wait a bit. There's a way to overcome that difficulty, of course. Stop here a minute or two, and I'll run back and pledge that Nippers fool to keep his mouth shut about it. He'll give me his promise, I know."
"To be sure he will. But how long do you suppose he will keep it? How long do you suppose that an empty-headed, gabbling old fool like that fellow will refrain from increasing his own importance in the neighbourhood by swaggering about and boasting of his intimacy with the powers at Scotland Yard and the rest of it? And even if he shouldn't, what about the others? The gathering of rustics that heard what he heard, the gamekeepers from the Drodger estate, the Nosworths as well as they. Can their mouths, too, be shut? They will not love me for this night's business, be sure. Then, too, they have lived in Paris. The woman is French by birth, of Montmartre, of the Apache class, the Apache kind, and she will know of the cracksman, be assured. So will her husband. And they won't take their medicine lying down, believe me. An accused man has the right to communicate with counsel, remember, and a wire up to London will cost less than a shilling. So, as between Margot's crew and our friend Count Waldemar, la, there you are." Mr. Narkom screwed up his face and said something under his breath. He could not but follow this line of reasoning when the thing was put before him so plainly.
"And we had been so free from all worry over the beggars up to this," he said savagely. "But to get a hint, to pick up the scent out here in a wild bit of country like this, cinnamon, it makes me sweat. What do you propose to do?"
"The only thing that's left us to do," gave back Cleek. "Get out of it as quickly as possible and draw a red herring over the scent. In other words, put back to Dollops, abandon the caravan, make our way to some place where it is possible to telephone for the chap we hired it from to send out and get it,
then to make tracks for home." "Yes, but why bother about telephoning, old chap? Why can't we drop in ourselves and tell the man when we get back to Sheffield on our way to London?" "Because we're not going back to Sheffield, my friend. Not going in for anything so silly as twice travelling over the same ground, if it's all the same to you," replied Cleek, as he swung off from the highway on to the dark, still moor and struck out for the place where they had left Dollops and the caravan. "At best, we can't be more than 30 miles from the boundary line of Cumberland. A night's walking will cover that. There we can rest awhile, at some little out-of-the-way hostelry. Then take a train over the Scottish border and make for Dumfries. From that point on, the game is easy. There are 6 trains a day leaving for St. Pancras and 8 for Euston. We can choose which we like, and a 7 hours' ride will land us in London without having once doubled on our tracks or crossed the route by which we came out of it." "By James, what a ripping idea!" said Mr. Narkom approvingly. "Come along then, old chap. Let's get back to the boy and be about it as soon as possible."
Then he threw open his coat and waistcoat to get the full benefit of the air before facing the ordeal, and, falling into step with Cleek, struck out over the moor at so brisk a dog trot that his short, fat legs seemed fairly to twinkle. End of Section 13. Cleek of Scotland Yard by Thomas W. Hanshew. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. By the side of the little chattering stream that flowed through the bit of woodland where Mr. Nippers and his associates had come upon them, they found Dollops, with his legs drawn up, his arms folded across his knees and his forehead resting upon them, sleeping serenely over the embers of a burnt-out fire. He was still making music, but of a kind which needed no assistance from a mouth harmonica to produce it. They awoke him and told him of the sudden change in the programme and of the need for haste in carrying it out.
"Oh, so help me! Them Apaches, eh? And that foreign josser Count What's-his-name, too?" said he, rubbing his eyes and blinking sleepily. "Right you are, Governor. Gimme 2 seconds to get the cobwebs out of me thinking box, and I'm ready to face marching orders as soon as you like. My hat, though, but this is a startler. I can understand what them Apache Johnnies has got against you, sir, of course. But what that Mauravanian biscuit is getting after you for beats me. What did you ever do to the blighter, Governor? Trip him up in some little bit of crooked business, sir, and did him down, as the 'Mericans say?" "Something like that," returned Cleek. "Don't waste time in talking. Simply get together such things as we shall need, and let us be off about our business as soon as possible." Dollops obeyed instructions upon both points, obeyed them indeed with such alacrity that he shut up like an oyster forthwith, dived into the caravan and bounced out again, and within 5 minutes of the time he had been told of the necessity for starting, had started, and was forging away with the others over the dark, still moor, and facing cheerily the prospect of a 30-mile walk to Cumberlandshire. All through the night they pressed onward thus, the 2 men walking shoulder to shoulder and the boy at their heels, over vast stretches of moorland where bracken and grass hung heavy and glittering under their weight of dew, down the craggy sides of steep gullies where the spring freshets had quickened mere trickles into noisy water splashes that spewed over the rocks to fall into chuckling, froth-filled pools below, along twisting paths, through the dark, still woodland stretches, and thence out upon the wild, wet moor again, with the wind in their faces and the sky all a-prickle with steadily dimming stars. And by the mist-wrapped moon dropped down out of sight. The worn-out night dwindled and died, and steadily brightening glory went blushing up the east to flower the pathway for the footfalls of the morning. But as yet the farthermost outposts of Cumberland were miles beyond the range of vision, so that the long tramp was by no means ended,
and feeling the necessity for covering as much ground as possible while the world at large was still in what Dollops was wont to allude to as the arms of Murphy's house, the little party continued to press onward persistently. By 4 o'clock they were again off the moors and in the depths of craggy gorges. By 5 they were on the borders of a deep, still tarn, and had called a halt to light a fire and get things out of the bag which Dollops carried, things to eat and to drink and to wear, and were enjoying a plunge in the ice-cold water the while the coffee was boiling. And by 6, gorged with food and soothed by tobacco, they were lying sprawled out on the fragrant earth and blinking drowsily while their boots were drying before the fire. And after that there was a long hiatus until Cleek's voice rapped out, saying sharply,
"Well, I'll be dashed! Rouse up there, you lazy beggars. Do you know that it's 12:30 and we've been sleeping for hours?"
They knew it then, be assured, and were up on their way again with as little delay as possible. Rested and refreshed, they made such good time that 2 o'clock found them in the Morecambe Abbey district just over the borders of Cumberland, and, with appetites sharpened for luncheon, bearing down on a quaint little hostelry whose signboard announced it as the Rose and Thistle.
"Well, there's hospitality, if you like,"
said Cleek, as, at their approach, a cheery-faced landlady bobbed up at an open window and, seeing them, bobbed away again and ran round to welcome them with smiles and curtsies delivered from the arch of a vine-bowered door. "Welcome, gentlemen, welcome!" beamed she as they came up and joined her. "But however in the world did you manage to get over here so soon? The train not being due at Shepperton Old Cross until 25 past 1, and that a good mile and a quarter away as the crow flies. However, better too early than too late, Major Norcross and Lady Mary being already here and most anxious to meet you." As it happened that neither Cleek nor Mr. Narkom had any personal acquaintance with the lady and gentleman mentioned, it was so clearly a case of mistaken identity that the superintendent had it on the tip of his tongue to announce the fact, when there clashed out the sound of a door opening and shutting rapidly, a clatter of hasty footsteps along the passage, and presently there came into view the figure of a bluff, hearty, florid-faced man of about 45, who thrust the landlady aside and threw a metaphorical bombshell by exclaiming excitedly,
"My dear sir, I never was so delighted. Talk about English slowness. Why, this is prompt enough to satisfy a Yankee. I never dispatched my letter to you until late yesterday afternoon, Mr. Narkom. And, by the way, which is Mr. Narkom, and which that amazing Mr. Cleek? Or, never mind. Perhaps that clever Johnny will be coming later. You can tell me all about that afterward. For the present, come along. Let's not keep Lady Mary waiting. She's anxious. This way, please."
Here, as Mr. Narkom had lost no time in acknowledging his identity, it being clear that no mistake had been made after all, here he caught the superintendent by the arm, whisked him down the passage, and throwing open the door at the end of it, announced excitedly,
"All right, Mary. The Yard's answered. The big reward's caught 'em, as I knew it would. And here's Narkom. That chap Cleek will come by a later train, no doubt."
The response to this came from an unexpected quarter. Of a sudden, the man he had left standing at the outer door, under the impression that he was in no way connected with the superintendent, but merely a gentleman who had reached the inn at the same time, came down the passage to the open door, brushed past him into the room, and announced gravely,
"Permit me to correct an error, please, Major. The man Cleek is not coming later. He is here, and very much at your and Lady Mary Norcross' service, believe me. I have long known the name of Major Seton Norcross as one which stands high in the racing world, as that indeed of the gentleman who owns the finest stud in the kingdom, and whose filly Highland Lassie is first favourite for the forthcoming Derby, and I now have the honour of meeting the gentleman himself, it seems."
The effect of this was somewhat disconcerting, for, as he concluded it, he put out his hand and rested it upon Mr. Narkom's shoulder, whereat Lady Mary half rose from her seat, only to sit down again suddenly and look round at her liege lord with uplifted eyebrows and lips slightly parted. Afterward she declared of the two men standing side by side in that familiar manner, "One reminded me of an actor trying to play the part of a person of distinction, and the other of a person of distinction trying to play the part of an ordinary actor, and not quite able to keep what he really was from showing through the veneer of what he was trying to be." The Major, however, was too blunt to bottle up his sentiments at any time, and being completely bowled over in the present instance, put them into bluff, outspoken, characteristic words.
"Oh, gum games!" he blurted out. "If you really are Cleek."
"I really am. Mr. Narkom will stand sponsor for that."
"But good lud, man! Oh, look here, you know, this is all tommy rot. What under God's heaven has brought a chap like you down to this sort of thing?"
"Opinions differ upon that score, Major," said Cleek quietly. "So far from being brought down, it is my good friend Mr. Narkom here who has brought me up to it and made me his debtor for life."
"Debtor nothing! Don't talk rubbish. As if it were possible for a gentleman not to recognize a gentleman."
"It would not be so easy, I fear, if he were a good actor, and you have just done me the compliment of indirectly telling me that I must be one. It is very nice of you, but may we not let it go at that? I fancy from what I hear that I, too, shall soon be in the position to pay compliments, Major. I hear on every side that Highland Lassie is sure to carry off the Derby. In fact, that unless a miracle occurs, there'll be no horse in it but her." Here both the Major and his wife grew visibly excited.
"Gad, sir!"
exclaimed he, in a voice of deep despair.
"I'm afraid you will have to amend that statement so that it may read, 'Unless a miracle occurs, there will be every horse in it but her. Every blessed one, from Dawson Blake's Tarantula, the second favourite, down to the last also ran of the lot.'"
"Good heavens! The filly hasn't gone wrong suddenly, has she?"
"She's done more than gone wrong. She's gone altogether. Some beastly, low-lived cur of a horse thief broke into the stables the night before last and stole her. Stole her, sir, body and bones, and there's not so much as a hoof-print to tell what became of her."
"Well, I'm blessed."
"Are you? Begad, then, you're about the only one who knows about it that is. For as if that wasn't bad enough, I've not only lost the best filly in England, but the best trainer as well. And the brute that carried off the one got at the other at the same time, dash him."
"What do you mean by 'got at' the trainer, Major? Did the man take a bribe and sell you that way?"
"What, Tom Farrow? Never in God's world. Nor that kind of a chap, by George. The man that offered Tom Farrow a bribe would spend the rest of the week in bed. Gad, yes. A more faithful chap never drew the breath of life. God only knows when or how the thing happened, but Farrow was found on the moor yesterday morning, quite unconscious and at death's door. He had been bludgeoned in the most brutal manner imaginable. Not only was his right arm broken, but his skull was all but crushed in. There was concussion of the brain, of course. Poor fellow, he can't speak a word, and the chances are that he never will be able to do so again."
"Bad business, that," declared Cleek, looking grave. "Any idea of who may possibly have been the assailant? Local police picked up anything in the nature of a clue?"
"The local police know nothing whatsoever about it. I have not reported the case to them."
"Not reported? Rather unusual course, that, to pursue, isn't it? When a man has his place broken into, a valuable horse stolen, and his trainer all but murdered, one would naturally suppose that his first act would be to set the machinery of the law in motion without an instant's delay. That is, unless yes, just so."
"What is just so?"
inquired the Major eagerly.
"You seem to have hit upon some sort of an idea right at the start. Mind telling me what it is?"
"Certainly not. I could imagine that when a man keeps silent about such a thing at such a time, There is a possibility that he has a faint idea of who the criminal may be, and that he has excellent reasons for not wishing the world at large to share that idea. In other words, that he would sooner lose the value of the animal 50 times over than have the crime brought home to the person he suspects. End of section 14. Of Cleek of Scotland Yard by Thomas W. Hanshew. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. Lady Mary made a faint moaning sound. The Major's face was a study.
"I don't know whether you're a wizard or not, Mr. Cleek," he said after a moment, "but you have certainly hit upon the facts of the matter. It is for that very reason that I have refrained from making the affair public. It is bad enough that Lady Mary and I should have our suspicions regarding the identity of the person implicated without letting others share them. There's Dawson Blake, for one. If he knew, he'd move heaven and earth to ruin him."
"Dawson Blake?" repeated Cleek. "Pardon, but will that be the particular Sir Gregory Dawson Blake, the millionaire brewer who achieved a knighthood in the last honours list, and whose horse Tarantula is second favourite for the coming Derby?"
"Yes, the very man. He is almost what you might call a neighbour of ours, Mr. Cleek. His place, Castle Claverdale, is just over the border line of Northumberland, and about 5 miles distant from Morecambe Abbey. His stables are, if anything, superior to my own, and we both use the intervening moorland as a training ground. Also, it was Dawson Blake's daughter that Lieutenant Chadwick played fast and loose with. Jilted her, you know, threw her over at the 11th hour, and married a chorus girl who had nothing to bless herself with but a pretty face and a long line of lodging-house ancestry. Not that Miss Dawson Blake lost anything by getting rid of such a man before she committed the folly of tying herself to him for life, but her father never forgave Lieutenant Chadwick and would spend $1 million for the satisfaction of putting him behind bars."
"I see. And this Lieutenant Chadwick is whom, may I ask?" "The only son of my elder and only sister, Mr. Cleek," supplied Lady Mary with a faint blush. "She committed the folly of marrying her music master when I was but a little girl, and my father died without ever looking at her again. Subsequently her husband deserted her and went, she never learnt where, to the day of her death. While she lived, however, both my brother, Lord Chevelmere, and I saw that she never wanted for anything. We also supplied the means to put her son through Sandhurst after we had put him through college, and hoped that he would repay us by achieving honour and distinction. It was a vain hope. He achieved nothing but disgrace. Shortly after his deplorable marriage with the theatrical person for whom he threw over Miss Dawson Blake, and who in turn threw him over when she discovered what a useless encumbrance he was cashiered from the army, and has ever since been a hanger-on at race meetings, the consort of touts, billiard-markers, card-sharpers, and people of that sort. I had not seen him for 6 years, when he turned up suddenly in this neighbourhood 3 days ago, and endeavoured to scrape acquaintance with one of the Abbey grooms."
"And under an assumed name, Mr. Cleek," supplemented the Major somewhat excitedly. "He was calling himself John Clark, and was trying to wheedle information regarding Highland Lassie out of my stable boys. Fortunately, Lady Mary caught sight of him without being seen, and at once gave orders that he was to be turned off the premises, and never allowed to come near them again. He was known, however, to be in this neighbourhood up to dusk on the following evening, but he has never been seen since Highland Lassie disappeared. You know now, perhaps, why I have elected to conduct everything connected with this affair with the utmost secrecy. Little as we desire to be in any way associated with such a man, we cannot but remember that he is connected with us by ties of blood. and unless Farrow dies of his injuries, which God forbid, we will hush the thing up, cost what it may. All that I want is to get the animal back, not to punish the man, if indeed he be the guilty party, for there is really no actual proof of that. But if Dawson Blake knew, it would be different. He would move heaven and earth to get the convict's broad arrow on him, and to bring disgrace upon everybody connected with the man."
I see," said Cleek, puckering up his brows and thoughtfully stroking his chin. "So that naturally there is, with this added to the rivalry of the two horses, no very good blood existing between Sir Gregory Dawson-Blake and yourself."
"No, there is not. If, apart from these things, Mr. Cleek, you want my private opinion of the man, it can be summed up in the word 'bounder.' There is not one instinct of the gentleman about him. He is simply a vulgar, money-gilded, low-minded cad, and I wouldn't put it beyond him to be mixed up in this disappearance of the filly himself, but that I know Chadwick was about the place, and for there to be anything between Chadwick and him is as impossible as it is for the two poles to come together or for oil to assimilate with water. That is the one thing in this world that Dawson Blake would not do under any circumstances whatsoever. Beyond that, I put nothing beneath the man. Nothing too despicable for him to attempt in the effort to gain his own end and aim. He races not for the sport of the thing, but for the publicity, the glory of getting talked about and of making the vulgar stir. He wants the blue ribbon of the turf for the simple fame of the thing, and he'd buy it if buying it were possible, and either bribes or trickery could carry off the race."
That's a sweeping assertion, Major."
"But made upon a basis of absolute fact, Mr. Cleek. He has twice endeavoured to buy Farrow to desert me by an offer of double wages and a pension, and failing that, only last week he offered my jockey £10,000 cash on the nail to slip over to France on the night before Derby Day, and promised him a further 5,000 if Tarantula carried off the race."
"Oh ho!" said Cleek in two different tones, and with a look of supremest contempt. "So our tin plate knight is that sort of a sportsman, is he, the cad? And having failed to get hold of the rider yes, it is possible, perhaps. Chadwick's turning up at such a time might be a mere coincidence, a mere tout's trick to get inside information beforehand, or well, you never can tell. Suppose, Major, you give me the facts from the beginning. When was the animal's loss discovered, and how? Let me have the full particulars, please." The Major sighed and dropped heavily into a chair.
"For an affair of such far-reaching consequences, Mr. Cleek," he said gloomily, "it is singularly bald of what might be called details, I'm afraid. And beyond what I have already told you, there is really very little more to tell. When or how the deed was committed, it is impossible to decide beyond the indefinite statement that it happened the night before last, at some time after 9:30 in the evening, when the stable boy Dewlish, before going home, carried a pail of water at Farrow's request into the building where Highland Lassie's stall is located, and 5 o'clock the next morning, when Captain MacTavish strolled into the stables and found the mare missing."
"A moment, please. Who is Captain MacTavish? And why should the gentleman be strolling about the Abbey stable yard at 5 o'clock in the morning?"
"Both questions can be answered in a few words. Captain MacTavish is a friend who is stopping with us. He is a somewhat famous naturalist, writes articles and stories on bird and animal life for the magazines. It is his habit to be up and out hunting for specimens and things of that sort every morning just about dawn. At 5 he always crosses the stable yard on his way to the dairy, where he goes for a glass of fresh milk before breakfast."
"I see. Captain a young man or an old one?"
"Oh, young, of course. About 2 or 3 and 30, I should say. Brother of a deceased army pal of mine. Been stopping with us for the past 2 months. Very brilliant and very handsome chap. Universal favourite wherever he goes."
"Thanks. Now, just one more question before you proceed, please. About the train of Farrow getting the stable boy to carry in that pail of water. Would not that be a trifle unusual at such a time of the night?"
"I don't know. Yes, perhaps it would. I never looked at it in that light before."
"Very likely not. Stables would be closed and all the grooms, etc., off duty for the night at that hour, would they not?"
"Yes. That is, unless Farrow had reason for asking one of them to help him with something. That's what he did, by the way, with the boy, Dewlish."
"Just so. Any idea what he wanted with that pail of water at that hour of the night? He couldn't be going to water one of the horses, of course, and it is hardly likely that he intended to take on a stableman's duties and wash up the place."
"Oh, gravy, no. He's a trainer, not a slosh bucket. I pay him 1,800 a year and give him a cottage besides."
"Married man or a single one?"
"Single. A widower. About 40. Lost his wife 2 years ago. Rather thought he was going to take another one shortly, from the way things looked. But of late he and Maggie McFarland don't seem, for some reason or another, to be hitting it off together so well as they did."
"Who's Maggie McFarland, please?"
"One of the dairymaids. A little Scotch girl from Nairn who came into service at the Abbey about a 12-month ago."
I see. Then the filly isn't the only Highland lassie in the case, it would seem. Pardon? Oh, nothing. Merely a weak attempt to say something smart, that's all. Don't suppose that Maggie McFarland could by any possibility throw light upon the subject of that pail of water, do you, Major?"
"Good lud, no. Of course she couldn't. What utter rot! But see here, come to think of it now, perhaps I can. It's as like as not that he wanted it to wash himself with before he went over to the shoer's at Shefford and Old Cross with Chocolate Maid. I forgot to tell you, Mr. Cleek, that ever since Dawson Blake made that attempt to buy him off, Farrow became convinced that it wouldn't be safe to leave Highland Lassie unguarded night or day for fear of that cad's hirelings getting at her in some way or another. So he closed up his cottage and came to live in the rooms over the filly's stable, so as to be on the spot for whatever might or might not happen at any hour. He also bought a yapping little Scotch terrier that would bark if a match fell, and kept it chained up in the place with him. When the discovery of the filly's disappearance was made, that dog was found still attached to its chain, but as dead as Maria Martin. It had been poisoned. There was a bit of meat lying beside the body, and it was literally smothered in strychnine."
"Quite so. Keep strychnine about the place for killing rats, I suppose?"
"Yes, of course. They're a perfect pest about the granary and the fodder bins. But of course it wouldn't be lying round loose, a deadly thing like that. Besides, there never was any kept in that particular section of the stables, so the dog couldn't have got hold of it by accident. Then there's another thing I ought to tell you, Mr. Cleek. Highland Lassie never was stabled with the rest of the stud. We have always kept her in one especial stable. There are just 2 whacking big box stalls in the place. She occupies one and Chocolate Maid the other. Chocolate Maid is Lady Mary's personal property, a fine blooded filly that will make a name for herself one of these days, I fancy. Dark-coated and smooth as a piece of sealskin, the beauty. To-day she is the only animal in that unlucky place. Yes, come to think of it, Mr. Cleek, he added with a sort of sigh. "That is probably what the poor fellow wanted the pail of water for, to wash up and ride her over to the forge at Shepperton Old Cross."
Singular time to choose for such a proceeding, wasn't it, Major? After 9:30 o'clock at night?
"It would be if it were any other man and under any other circumstances. But remember, it is but 3 weeks to Derby Day, and every hour of daylight is worth so much gold to us. Farrow knew that he could not spare a moment of it for any purpose, and he is most particular over the shoeing. Will see it done himself and direct the operation personally. Sort of mania with him. Wouldn't let the best man that ever lived take one of the horses over for him. Go himself, no matter what inconvenience it put him to. Farrier at Shepperton Old Cross knows his little fads and fancies and humours them at all times. Would open the forge and fire up for him if it were 2 o'clock in the morning."
"I see. And did he take Chocolate Maid over there on that night after all?"
"Yes. Lady Mary and I attended a whist drive at Farmingdale Priory that evening, but her ladyship was taken with a violent headache and we had to excuse ourselves and leave early. It would be about 11:15 o'clock when we returned to the Abbey and met Farrow riding out through the gates on Chocolate Maid. We stopped and spoke to him. He was then going over to the shoers with the mare."
"How long would it take him to make the journey?"
"Oh, about 25 minutes, maybe half an hour. Certainly not more."
"So then it would be about 11:15 when he arrived at the farrier's? I see. Any idea at what time he got back?"
"Not the ghost of one. In fact, we should never have known that he ever did get back, for nobody heard a sound of his return the whole night long, were it not that when Captain MacTavish crossed the stable yard at 5 o'clock in the morning and, seeing the door ajar, looked in, he found Chocolate Maid standing in her stall, the dog dead, and Highland Lassie gone. Of course, Chocolate Maid being there after he had passed Farrow on the road with her was proof that he did return at some hour of the night, you know, though when it was, or why he should have gone out again, heaven alone knows. Personally, you know, I am of the opinion that Highland Lassie was stolen while he was absent; that on returning he discovered the robbery, and following the trail went out after the robbers, and coming up with them got his terrible injuries that way."
Yes, I don't think. What trail was he to find, please, when you just now told me that there wasn't so much as a hoof print to tell the tale? Or was that an error?"
"No, it wasn't. The entire stable yard is paved with red tiles, and we've had such an uncommon spell of dry weather lately that the earth of the surrounding country is baked as hard as a brickbat. An elephant wouldn't make a footmark upon it, much less a horse. But gravy, man! Instead of making the thing clearer, I'm blessed if you're not adding gloom to darkness and rendering it more mysterious than ever. What under the four corners of heaven could Farrow have followed, then, if the trail is to be eliminated entirely?"
"Maybe his own inclination, Major. Maybe nothing at all," said Cleek enigmatically. "If your little theory of his returning and finding Highland Lassie stolen were a thing that would hold water, I am inclined to think that Mr. Tom Farrow would have raised an alarm that you could hear for half a mile, and that if he had started out after the robbers he would have done so with a goodly force of followers at his heels and with all the lanterns and torches that could be raked and scraped together."
"Good lad, yes, of course he would. I never thought of that. Did you, Mary? His whole heart and soul were bound up in the animal. If he had thought that anything had happened to her, if he had known that she was gone, a pit full of raging devils would have been spirits of meekness beside him. Man alive, you make my head whiz. For him to go off over the moor without word or cry at such a time. I say, Mr. Cleek, for God's sake, what do you make of such a thing as that at such a time, eh?"
"Well, Major," replied Cleek, "I hate to destroy any man's illusions and to besmirch any man's reputation, But que voulez-vous? If Mr. Tom Farrow went out upon that moor after the mare was stolen, and went without giving an alarm or saying a word to anybody, then in my private opinion your precious trainer is nothing in the world but a precious double-faced, double-dealing, dishonourable blackguard who treacherously sold you to the enemy and got just what he deserved by way of payment." Major Norcross made no reply. He simply screwed up his lips until they were a mere pucker of little creases, and looked round at his wife with something of the pain and hopeless bewilderment of an unjustly scolded child. "You know, Seton, it was what Captain MacTavish suggested," ventured she, gently and regretfully. "And when two men of intellect—" Then she sighed and let the rest go by default.
Damn it, Mary, you don't mean to suggest that I haven't any, do you?"
"No, dear, but—"
"Buts be blowed! Don't you think I know a man when I run foul of him? And if ever there was a square-dealing, honest chap on this earth— Look here, Mr. Cleek. Gad, you may be a bright chap and all that, but you'll have to give me something a blessed sight stronger than mere suspicion before you can make me believe a thing like that about Tom Farrow."
"I am not endeavouring to make you believe it, Major. I am merely showing you what would certainly be the absolute truth of the matter if Tom Farrow had done what you suggested and gone out on that moor alone and without a word or a cry when he discovered that the animal was stolen. But, my dear sir, I incline to the belief that he never did go out there after any person or any living thing whatsoever."
"Then, dash it, sir, how in thunder are you going to explain his being there at all?"
"By the simple process, Major, of suggesting that he was on his way back to the Abbey at the time he encountered his unknown assailant. In other words, that he had not only never returned to the place after you and her ladyship saw him leaving it at 11:15, but was never permitted to do so."
"Oh, come, I say! That's laying it on too thick. How the dickens can you be sure of such a thing as that?"
"I'm not. I am merely laying before you the only two things possible to explain his presence there. One or the other of them is the plain and absolute truth. If the man went out there after the filly was stolen, he is a scoundrel and a liar. If he is innocent, he met with his injuries on the way back to his quarters above Highland Lassie's stall."
"But the other animal? But Chocolate Maid? How could she have got back to the stable, then? She couldn't have found her way back alone after Farrow was assaulted. At least she could, of course, but not in the condition she was in when found next morning. She had no harness of any sort upon her. Her saddle was on its peg. She was in her box, tied up, b'gad, and the door of the box was closed and bolted, so that if by any chance— Hello, I say, what on earth are you smiling in that queer way for? Hang it, man, do you believe that I don't know what I'm talking about?"
"Oh, yes, Major. It isn't that kind of a smile. I have just discovered that 4 and 4 make 8 when you add them up properly, and the smile is one of consequent satisfaction. A last question, please. At what time in the morning was Farrow found lying unconscious upon the moor?"
"Somewhere between 6 and 7 o'clock. Why?"
"Oh, nothing in particular. Who found him? Captain MacTavish?"
"No, Maggie McFarland. She was just coming back from milking when— Hang it, man, I wish you wouldn't smile all up one side of your face in that confounded manner. It makes me think that you must have something up your sleeve."
"Well, if I have, Major, suppose you drive me over to the stables and give me a chance to take it out," suggested Cleek serenely. "A little poking about sometimes does wonders, and a half-hour in Highland Lassie's quarters may pick the puzzle to pieces a great deal sooner than you'd believe. Or stop. Perhaps, on second thought, it will be better for you and her ladyship to go on ahead, as I shall want to have a look at Tom Farrow's injuries as well, so it will be best to have everything prepared in advance in order to save time. No doubt Mr. Narkom and I can get a conveyance of some sort here. At any rate it is now 3:15, I see. At any rate, you may certainly expect us at 5:15. You and her ladyship may go back quite openly, Major. There will be no need to attempt to throw dust in Sir Gregory Dawson Blake's eyes any longer by keeping the disappearance of the animal a secret. If he's had a hand in her spiriting away, he knows, of course, that she's gone. But if he hasn't, oh, well, I fancy I know who did, and that she will be in the running on Derby Day after all. A few minutes in Highland Lassie's stable will settle that, I feel sure. Your ladyship, my compliments. Major, good afternoon. I hope, if night overtakes us before we get at the bottom of the thing, you can manage to put us up at the Abbey until to-morrow, that we may be on the spot to the last. With pleasure, Mr. Cleek, said Lady Mary, and bowed him out of the room. End of section 15. Of Cleek of Scotland Yard by Thomas W. Hanshew. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. It was precisely 10 minutes past 5 o'clock, and the long-lingering May twilight was but just beginning to gather, when the spring cart of the Rose and Thistle arrived at the Abbey stables, and Cleek and Mr. Narkom, descending therefrom, found themselves the centre of an interested group, composed of the Major and Lady Mary, the countryside doctor, and Captain MacTavish. The captain, who had nothing Scottish about him but his name, was a smiling, debonair gentleman with flaxen hair and a curling fair moustache, and Cleek, catching sight of him as he stood leaning in a carefully studied pose against the stable door-post, with one foot crossed over the other, one hand in his trousers pocket, and the other swinging a hunting crop whose crook was a greyhound's head wrought in solid silver, concluded that here was, perhaps, the handsomest man of his day, and that, in certain sections of society, he might be guaranteed to break hearts by the 100. It must be said of him, however, that he carried his manifold charms of person with smooth serenity and perfect poise, that if he realized his own beauty, he gave no outward evidences of it. He was calm, serene, well-bred, and had nothing of the doll or the Johnny element in either his bearing or his deportment. He was at once splendidly composed and almost insolently bland.
Pleased to meet you, Mr. Cleek. Read a great deal about you, one way and another,
he said when the Major made the introduction, a performance which the captain evidently considered superfluous as between an army officer and a police detective.
Sorry I shan't be able to remain and study your interesting methods, however. Should have been rather pleased to do so otherwise.
And I, for my part, should have been pleased to have you do so, Captain, I assure you, replied Cleek, the first intonation of his voice causing the captain to twitch up his head and stare at him as if he were a monstrosity. Shall you be leaving us, then, before the investigation is concluded?
Well, I'm blessed. Why, how in the world... yes, obliged to go. Wire from London this afternoon. Regiment sails for India in 2 days. Beastly nuisance. Shall miss the Derby and all that. By the way, Norcross, if this chap succeeds in finding the filly in time for the race, that little bet of ours stands, of course? Of course, agreed the Major. Ready, are you, Mr. Cleek? Right you are. Come along.
And he forthwith led the way into the stable where Chocolate Maid, like a perfect horse in French bronze, stood munching hay in her box as contentedly as if there were no such things in the world as touts and swindlers and horse thieves, and her companion of 2 days ago still shared the quarters with her.
"Gad, but she's a beauty and no mistake, Major,"
said Cleek as he went over and, leaning across the low barrier of the enclosure, patted the mare's shoulder and smoothed her glossy neck.
"I don't wonder that you and her ladyship have such high hopes for her future. The creature seems well nigh perfect." "Yes, she is a pretty good bit of horseflesh," replied he, "but not to be compared with Highland Lassie in speed, wind, or anything. There she is, Mr. Cleek, and it's as natural as life, the beauty."
Speaking, he waved his hand toward a framed picture of the missing animal, a coloured gift plate which had been given away with the Easter number of the Horseman, and which Farrow had had glazed and hung just over her box. Cleek, following the direction of the indicating hand, looked up and saw the counterfeit presentment of a splendidly proportioned sorrel, with a splash of white on the flank and a white stocking on the left forefoot.
"A beauty, as you say, Major,"
agreed he.
"But do you know that I, for my part, prefer the charms of Chocolate Maid? Maybe bad judgment upon my part, but there you are. What a coat! What a colour! What splendid legs, the beauty! Mind if I step in for a moment and have a look at her?"
The Major did not, so he went in forthwith and proceeded to look over the animal's points, feeling her legs, stroking her flanks, examining her hoofs. And it was then, and then only, that the Major remembered about the visit to the farriers over at Shepperton Old Cross, and began to understand that it was not all simple admiration of the animal, this close examination of her.
"Oh, by Jove! I say!"
he blurted out as he made, with Cleek, a sudden discovery, his face going first red and then very pale under the emotions thus engendered.
"She hasn't any new shoes on, has she? So she can't have been taken to the farriers after all."
"No," said Cleek, "she can't. I half suspected that she hadn't, so well, let it go. Let's have a look round Highland Lassie's box, please. Yes, very nice. Very splendid. Everything of the best, and all in apple pie order. By the way, Major, you surely don't allow harness to be washed and oiled in here?"
"Certainly not. What in the world could have put such an idea into your head?"
"Merely that bit of rag and that dirty sponge tucked in the corner over there and half covered by the bedding." The Major went over and touched the things with the toe of his boot.
"It's one of those imps of stable boys, the young vandals,"
he declared as he kicked the rag and the sponge out of the box and across the stable floor.
"It's well for them that Farrow isn't about, or there would be some cuffed ears for that sort of presumption, the young beggars. Hullo! Found something else?"
"No," said Cleek. "That is, nothing of any importance. Merely a bit torn from an old handbill, see? It probably got mixed up with the bedding. It's of no account, anyhow." Here he gave his hand a flirt, as if flinging the bit of paper over the low barrier of the box, instead of which he cleverly palmed it and afterward conveyed it unsuspected to his pocket.
"You were right in what you declared this afternoon, Major. For a case of such far-reaching effects, it is singularly bald in the matter of detail. At all events, there's no more to be discovered here. By the way, Doctor, am I privileged to go up and see the patient? I should like to do so, if I may." "By all means, sir, by all means," replied the doctor. "I am happy to inform you that his condition has considerably improved since my visit at noon, Mr. Cleek, and I have now every hope that he may pull through all right."
"Excellent," said Cleek. "But I think I shouldn't let that good news go abroad just yet awhile, Doctor. If you haven't taken anybody into your confidence regarding it as yet, don't do so. You haven't, have you?"
"No. That is, nobody but those who are now present. I told the Major and her ladyship on their return this afternoon, of course, and, naturally, Captain MacTavish. He was with me at the time I made the examination, which led me to arrive at the conclusion that the man would survive."
"Ah," said Cleek, and the curious one-sided smile went slowly up his cheek. "Oh, well, everything is all right among friends, of course, but I shouldn't let it go any farther. And now, if you please, let us go up to Farrow's room." They went up forthwith, Lady Mary alone refraining from joining the group, and a moment or two later Cleek found himself standing beside the bed of the unconscious trainer. He was a strong, sturdily built man, this Tom Farrow, upon whose integrity the Major banked so heavily in his warm, trustful, outspoken way. And if the face is any index to the mind, which in 9 cases out of 10 it isn't, that trustfulness and confidence were not misplaced. For Farrow's was a frank, open countenance which suggested a clear conscience and an honest nature, even though it was now pale and drawn with the lines that come of suffering and injury. At Cleek's request, the doctor removed the bandages and allowed him to inspect the wound at the back of the head. Made with a heavy implement shaped somewhat after the fashion of a golf stick, and almost as heavy as a sledge-hammer," he commented. "Arm broken, too. Probably that was done first, and the man struck again after he was on the ground and unable to defend himself. There are 2 blows, you see. This one just above the ear, and that crushing one at the back of the head. That's all I care to see, Doctor, thank you. You may replace the bandages." Nevertheless, although he asserted this, it was noticeable that his examination of the stricken trainer did not end here. For while the doctor was busy replacing the bandages, he took the opportunity to lift the man's hands and inspect them closely, parting the fingers and looking at the thin, loose folds of skin between them. A few minutes later, the bandages being replaced and the patient turned over to the nurse in charge, the entire party left the room and filed down the stairs together.
"Any ideas, Mr. Cleek?"
questioned the Major eagerly. "Yes, plenty of them," replied he. "I rather fancy we shall not have to put you to the trouble of housing us at the Abbey to night, Major. The case is a shallower one than I fancied at first. Shouldn't be surprised if we cleared it all up inside of the next 2 hours."
"Well, I'll be dithered!"
exclaimed the Major, aghast.
"Do you mean to tell me that you've got at the bottom of the thing? That you've found something that leads you to suspect where the animal is?"
"More than suspect, Major. I know where she is. By 7:30 o'clock to-night, if you want me to make you a promise, I'll put her bridle into your hands, and she will be at the other end of it."
"You will?"
"I certainly will, Major. My word for it."
"Well, of all the dash I'm done. I'm winded. I'm simply scooped dry. Where on earth did you get your clues, man? You never did anything but walk about that I could see. And now to declare I say, MacTavish, did you hear that? Did you hear what he has promised, eh?"
"I heard," responded the Captain with a laugh, "but I believe when I see. I say, Mr. Inspector, where did you find the secret? Hidden between Farrow's fingers or wrapped around Chocolate Maid's legs?" "Both," said Cleek serenely. "Tell you something else, if you care to hear it. I know who poisoned the dog the other night. Farrow did it himself." The Major's exclamation of indignation was quite lost in the peal of the Captain's laughter.
"Ha, ha, ha! Hawkshaw out Hawkshawed!" cried he derisively. "Find out that, too, from Farrow's fingers?"
"Oh, no. That would be impossible. He washed them before he went out that night, and they've been washed by the nurse several times since. I found it out from the dog himself. And he's not the only dog in this little business, believe me. Though I'm willing to stake my reputation and my life upon it that neither one nor the other of them had any hand in spiriting away the missing horse."
"Who did, then, Mr. Cleek? Who did?"
"Tom Farrow and Tom Farrow alone, Major," began Cleek, and then stopped suddenly, interrupted by a painful circumstance. By this time they had reached the foot of the stairs and were filing out into the stable again, and there, by the open door, Lady Mary Norcross was standing, endeavouring to soothe and to comfort a weeping girl, Maggie McFarland, the dairymaid from Nairn.
"Oh, but say, winna, dee, say, winna," she was crying out distressfully. "If I thought the sin o' that were added to the sair conscience o' me."
Then, with a sudden intaking of the breath as if drowning, and a sudden paleness that made her face seem ivory white, she cowered away, with hands close shut and eyes wide with fright, as she looked up and saw the gentleman descending.
"It winna matter, it winna matter. I can come again, my lady,"
she said, in a frightened sort of whisper, which rose suddenly to a sort of wailing cry as she faced round and ran like a thing pursued. Cleek glanced round quietly and looked at Captain MacTavish. He was still his old, handsome, debonair, smiling self, but there was a look in his eyes which did not make them a very pleasant sight at present.
"Upon my word, Seton, I cannot make out what has come over that silly girl," said Lady Mary as her liege lord appeared. "She came here begging to be allowed to go up and see Farrow, and to be assured that he would live, and then the moment you all put in an appearance she simply dashed away, as you saw. I really cannot understand what can be the matter with her."
"Don't bother about that just now, Mary. Don't bother about anything, my dear, but what this amazing man has promised," exclaimed the Major excitedly. "Do you know, he has declared that if we give him until 7:30 to-night—"
Here Cleek interrupted. "Your pardon, Major. I amend that," he said. "I know all about the horse, and it will not now take so long as I thought to know all about the dog as well. Give me 1 hour, Major, just one, gentlemen all, and I will give you the answer to the riddle, every part of it, dog's part as well as horse's, here on this spot, so surely as I am a living man. Major, all I ask of you is one thing. Let me have a couple of your grooms out there on the moor inside of the next 15 minutes, please. May I have them?"
"Certainly, Mr. Cleek. As many as you want."
2 will do, thanks. 2 are enough for fair play in any little bout, and not going to stop and see the finish, Captain? It will all be over in an hour."
"Sorry, but I've got my packing to attend to, my man."
"Ah, to be sure. Oh, well, it doesn't matter. You know the proverb, 'If the mountain will not come to Mahomet, why, Mahomet must go to the mountain,' of course," said Cleek. "I'll just slip round to the dairy and have a glass of milk to brace me up for the business, and then, in 1 hour, in just one by the watch, you shall have the answer to the riddle here." Then, with a bow to Lady Mary, he walked out of the stable and went round the angle of the building after Maggie McFarland. End of section 16. Of Cleek of Scotland Yard by Thomas W. Hanshew. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. He lived up to the letter of his promise. In an hour, he had said when he walked out, and it was an hour to the very tick of the minute when he came back. Mr. Narkom, knowing him so well, knowing how, in the final moments of his coup, he was apt to become somewhat spectacular and theatrical, looked for him to return with a flourish of trumpets and carry all before him with a whirlwind rush, so that it came in the nature of a great surprise when, with the calmness of a man coming in to tea, he entered the stable with a large stone bottle in one hand and an ostler's sponge in the other. "Well, gentlemen, I am here, you see," he said with extreme calmness, "and," indicating the bottle, "have brought something with me to do honour to the event. No, not to drink. It is hardly that sort of stuff. It is spirit of wine, Major. I found it over in Farrow's cottage and have brought it with me, as he, poor chap, meant to do in time himself. There are some wonderful things in Tom Farrow's cottage, Major. They will pay for looking into, I assure you." "Pardon, Mr. Narkom? A criminal? Oh, no, my friend. A martyr." "A martyr?" "Yes, your ladyship. Yes, Major. A martyr. A martyr to his love, a martyr to his fidelity. As square a man and as faithful a trainer as ever set foot in a stable yard. That's Tom Farrow. I take off my hat to him. The world can do with more of his kind."
"But, my dear sir, you said that it was he that spirited away the animal, that it was he and he alone who was responsible for her disappearance."
"Quite so. And I say it again. Gently, gently, Major. I'll come to it in a minute. Personally, I should like to put it off to the last. It's such a fine thing for a finish, by Jove. But well, it can't be done under the circumstances. In other words, there is a part of this little business this evening which I must ask Lady Mary not to stop to either hear or see. But as she is naturally interested in the matter of Highland Lassie's disappearance, I will take up that matter first and ask her to kindly withdraw after the filly has been restored."
"Gad! You've found her, then? You've got her?"
"Yes, Major, I've got her. And as I promised that I would put her bridle into your hand with the animal herself at the other end of it, why, here you are." Speaking, he walked across to the box where the brown filly was tethered, unbolted it, unfastened the animal, and led her out. "Here you are, Major," he said as he tendered him the halter. "Take hold of her, the beauty, and may she carry off the Derby Stakes with flying colours."
"But, good lud, man, what on earth are you talking about? This is Chocolate Maid. This is Lady Mary's horse."
"Oh, no, Major, oh, no. Chocolate Maid is in the stable at Farrow's cottage, hidden away and half starved, poor creature, because he couldn't go back to feed and look after her. This is your bonny Highland Lassie, dyed to look like the other and to throw possible horse nobblers and thieves off the scent. If you doubt it, look here." He uncorked the bottle, poured some of the spirit of wine on the sponge, and rubbed the animal's brown flank. The dark colour came away, the sorrel hide and the white splotch began to appear, and before you could say Jack Robinson, the Major and Lady Mary had their arms about the animal's neck and were blubbing like a couple of children.
"Oh, my bully girl! Oh, my spiffing girl! Oh, Mary, isn't it clinking, dear? The lassie, the Highland Lassie, her own bonny self."
"Yes, her own bonny self, Major," said Cleek. "And you'd never have had a moment's worry over her if that faithful fellow upstairs had been suffered to get back here that night and to tell you about it in the morning. I've had a little talk with somebody who is in a position to give me information that corroborates my own little shots at the matter. I'll tell you all about that later on, and so am able to tell you a thing or two that you ought to have known before this. I don't know whether Lieutenant Chadwick's coming here and prying about had any wish to do harm to the horse at the back of it or not. I only know that Farrow thought it had, and he played this little trick to block the game and to throw dust into the eyes of anybody that attempted to get at her. What he did then was to dye her so that she might be mistaken for Chocolate Maid, then to take Chocolate Maid over to his own stable and hide her there until the time came to start for Epsom. That's what he wanted the pail of water for, Major, to mix the dye and to apply it. I half suspected it from the beginning, but I became sure of it when I found that scrap of paper in the bedding of the box. It was still wet, a bit of the label from the dye bottle which came off in the operation. Between the poor chap's fingers I found stains of the dye still remaining. Spirit of wine would have removed it, but washing in water wouldn't. Pardon, your ladyship? When did I begin to suspect that Farrow was at the bottom of it? Oh, when first I heard of the poisoned dog. Nobody ever heard it bark when the poisoner approached the stables. That, of course, meant that the person who administered the poison must have been someone with whom it was familiar, and also someone who was already inside the place, since even the first approaching step of friend or foe would have called forth one solitary bark at least. Farrow didn't do the things by halves, you see. He meant it to look like a genuine case of horse-stealing to outsiders, and killing the dog gave it just that touch of actuality which carries conviction. As for the rest, the Major must tell you that in private, your ladyship. The rest of this little matter is for men alone." Lady Mary bowed and passed out into the fast-coming dusk, and in the stable the Major, Cleek, and Narkom stood together, waiting until she was well beyond earshot. "Now, Major, we will get down to brass tacks, as our American cousins say," said Cleek, when that time at length came. "You would like to know, I suppose, how poor Farrow came by his injuries, and from whose hand. Well, you shall. He was coming back from his cottage after stabling the real Chocolate Maid there when the thing happened, and he received those injuries for rushing to the defence of the woman he loved and attempting to thrash the blackguard who had taken advantage of her trust and belief in him to spoil her life for ever. The woman was, of course, Maggie McFarland. The man was your charming guest, Captain MacTavish."
Good God! MacTavish? MacTavish?
"Yes, Major. The gallant captain who received such a sudden call to rejoin his regiment as soon as he knew that Tom Farrow was likely to recover and to speak. Perhaps you can understand now why Farrow and the girl no longer seemed to hit it off together as formerly. The gallant captain had come upon the boards. Dazzled by the beauty of him, tricked by the glib tongue of him, deluded into the belief that she had actually caught a gentleman, and that he really meant to make her his wife and take her away to India with him when he went, the silly, innocent, confiding little idiot became his victim, and threw over a good man's love for a handful of Dead Sea fruit. Never for one instant had Tom Farrow an idea of this, but the night before last, as he crossed the moor, he knew. In the darkness he stumbled upon the truth. He heard her crying out to the fellow to do her justice, to keep his word and make her the honest wife he had promised that she should be. And he heard, too, the man's characteristic reply. You can guess what happened, Major, when you know Tom Farrow. In 10 seconds he was up and at the fellow like a mad bull. The girl, terrified out of her life, screamed and ran away, seeing the brave captain laying about him with his heavy silver-headed hunting crop as she fled. She never saw the end of the fight, she never dared, but in the morning, when there was no Tom Farrow to be seen, she went out there on the moor and found him. She would have spoken then had she dared, poor creature, but the man's threat was an effective one. If she spoke, he would do likewise. If she kept silent, she might go away and her disgrace be safely hidden. Which she chose, we know."
"The damned hound!"
"Oh, no, Major, oh, no. That's too hard on hounds. The only hound-like thing about that interesting gentleman was that he made an attempt to get to cover and to run away. I knew that he would. I knew that this was his little dodge when he made that little excuse about having to pack up his effects. He saw how the game was running, and he meant to slip the cable and clear out while he had the chance."
"And you let him do it? You never spoke a word, but let the blackguard do it? Gad, sir, I'm ashamed of you."
"You needn't be, Major, on that score at least. Please remember that I asked for a couple of grooms to be stationed on the moor. I gave them their orders and then went on to Farrow's cottage alone. If they have followed out those orders, we shall soon see." Here he stepped to the door of the stable, put his 2 forefingers between his lips, and whistled shrilly. In half a minute more the 2 grooms came into the stable, and between them the gallant captain, tousled and rather dirty, and with his beautiful hair and moustache awry. "Got him, my lads, I see," said Cleek.
"Yes, sir. Nabbed him sneaking out the back way like you thought he would, sir, and being as you said it was the Major's orders, we copped him on the jump and have been holding of him for further orders ever since."
"Well, you can let him go now," said Cleek serenely, "and just give your attention to locking the door and lighting up. Major, Doctor, Mr. Narkom, pray be seated. The dear captain is going to give you all a little entertainment, and the performance is about to begin. As good with your fists as you are with a metal-headed hunting crop, Captain?"
"None of your dashed business what I'm good at," replied the captain. "Look here, Norcross—" "You cut that out at once!"
roared the Major.
"If you open your head to me, I'll bang it off you, you brute!" "Well, then, you, Mr. Policeman—"
"Ready for you in a minute, Captain. Don't get impatient," said Cleek, as he laid aside his coat and began to roll up his sleeves. "Rome wasn't built in a day, though beauty may be wrecked in a minute. You'll have the time of your life this evening. You are really too beautiful to live, Captain, and I'm going to come as near to killing you as I know how without actually completing the job. You see, that poor little Highland lassie hasn't a father or brother to do this business for her, so she's kindly consented to my taking it on in her behalf. I'm afraid I shall break that lovely nose of yours, my gay gallant, and I don't give a damn if I do. A brute that spoiled a woman's life deserves to go through the world with a mark to record it, and I'm going to put one on you to the best of my ability. All seated, gentlemen? Right you are. Now then, Captain, come on. Come on, you swine!" It was 20 minutes later. Lady Mary Norcross, deep in the obligatory business of dressing for dinner, had just taken up a powder puff and was assiduously dabbing the back of her neck when the door behind her opened softly and the voice of her liege lord travelled across the breadth of the room, saying,
"Mary, may I come in a minute, dear? I just want to get my cheque book out of your writing desk, that's all."
"Yes, certainly. Come in by all means," gave back her ladyship. "I'm quite alone. Springer has finished with me, and oh, good heavens! Seton! My dear, my dear!"
All right. Don't get frightened. It isn't mine. And it isn't his either, much of it. We've been having a little set to at the stable, and I got it hugging a policeman."
"Seton!"
"Yes, I know it's awful, but I simply couldn't help it." "Damn it, Mary, don't look so shocked. I'd have kissed the beggar as well if I thought I could acquire the trick of that heavenly jab with the left that way. I haven't had such a beautiful time since the day I was 21, darling. He fights like a blooming angel, that chap."
"What chap? What on earth are you talking about?"
"That man Cleek. Weeping widows. It was the prettiest job you ever saw. We're sending the beggar over to the hospital, and tell you all about it when I get back. Can't stop just now, dear. Bye-bye."
Then the door closed with a smack, and man and cheque-book were on their way downstairs. End of section 17. Section 18 of Cleek of Scotland Yard by Thomas W. Hanshew. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. It is a recognized fact in police circles that crime has a curious propensity for indulging in periodical outbursts of great energy, great fecundity, and then lapsing into a more or less sporadic condition for a time, like a gorged tiger that drowses and stirs only to lick its chops after a hideous feast. So that, following the lines of these fixed principles, the recent spell of criminal activity was succeeded by a sort of lull, and the next 2 weeks were idle ones for Cleek. Idle, but idyllic from his point of view, for he was back in the little house in the pleasant country lands now, with his walled garden, his ferns and his flowers, and the full glory of tulip time was here. And soon another glory would be here as well. In 12 more days she would be back in England. In 12 more days he and Dollops would move out, and Ailsa Lorne would move in, and this little Eden in the green and fragrant meadowlands would have another tenant from that time forth. But hers would not be a lonely tenancy, however, for Captain Horatio Burbage had recently written to Mrs. Condiment that, as the Sleeping Mermaid seemed likely to prove an unprofitable investment after all and to bring her little reward for her labours, he purposed relinquishing it and recalling old Joseph to him, and with that end in view had already secured for the good lady a position of companion housekeeper to one Miss Ailsa Lorne, who in the early part of June would call upon her at her present quarters and personally conduct her and the deaf and dumb maid of all work to their future ones. Here, then, in this bower of bloom, would this dear girl of his heart await the coming of that glorious day when the last act of restitution had been made, the last Vanishing Cracksman debt wiped off the slate, and he could go to her, clean-handed at last, to ask the fulfilment of her promise. Remembering that, it was a sheer delight to be free from all yard calls for a time, that he might give his whole attention to the work of getting the place ready for her. And day after day he was busy in the high-walled, old-world garden, digging, planting, pruning, that when she came it might be brimming over with flowers. But although he devoted himself mind and body to this task, and lived each day within the limits of that confining wall, he had not wholly lost touch with the world at large, for each morning the telephone, installed against the time of Ailsa's tenancy, put him into communication with Mr. Narkom at the Yard, and each night a newspaper carried in to him by Dollops kept him abreast of the topics of the times. It was over that telephone he received the first assurance that his haste in getting out of Yorkshire had not been an unnecessary precaution, his suspicions regarding the probable action of the Nosworths not ill grounded, for Mr. Narkom was able to inform him that carefully made inquiries had elicited the intelligence that, within 2 days of the Round House affair, men who were undoubtedly foreigners were making diligent inquiries throughout the West Riding regarding the whereabouts of 2 men and a boy who had been travelling about in a 2-horsed caravan.
"That sudden bolt of ours was a jolly good move, old chap,"
said the superintendent when he made this announcement.
"It did the beggars absolutely. Shouldn't be a bit surprised if they'd chucked the business as a bad job and gone back to the Continent disgusted. At any rate, none of my plain-clothes men has seen hide nor hair of one of the lot since, either in town or out. Waldemar, too, seems to have hooked it and can't be traced, so I reckon we've seen the last of him."
But Cleek was not so sure of that. He had his own ideas as to what this disappearance of the Apaches meant, and did not allow himself to be lulled into any sense of security by it. There were more ways than one in which to catch a weasel, he recollected, and determined not to relax his precautions in the smallest iota when next the Yard's call for his services should come. That it would come soon he felt convinced as the days advanced that rounded out the end of his 2nd week of freedom from it, and what form it would take when it did come was a matter upon which he could almost have staked his life, so sure he felt of it. For a time of great national excitement, great national indignation had arrived, and the press had made him acquainted with all the circumstances connected therewith, as why not, when the whole country was up in arms over it, and every newspaper in the land headlined it in double caps and poured forth the story in full detail. It had its genesis in something which had happened at Gosport in the preceding week, and happened in this startling manner. In the waterway between Barrow Island and the extreme end of the Royal Clarence Victualling Yard there had been found floating the body of a man of about 35 years of age, fully and fashionably clothed, and having all those outward signs which betoken a person of some standing. It was evident at once that death must have been the result of accident, and that the victim had been unable to swim, for the hands were encased in kid gloves, the coat was tightly buttoned, and a pair of field glasses in a leather case still hung from the long shoulder strap which supported the weight of them. The victim's inability to swim was established by the fact that he had made no effort to rid himself of these hampering conditions, and was clinging tightly to a foot-long bit of driftwood which he must have clutched at as it floated by. It was surmised, therefore, that the man must have fallen into the water in the dark, either from the foreshore or from some vessel or small boat in which he was journeying at the time, and had been carried away by the swift current and drowned without being missed, the condition of the body clearly establishing the fact that it had been in the water for something more than a fortnight when found. Later it was identified by one of the deckhands of the pleasure steamer which cruises round the Isle of Wight daily as being that of a man he had seen aboard that vessel on one of its night trips to Alum Bay between 2 or 3 weeks previously. And still later it was discovered that a boatman in that locality had been hired to take a gentleman from the Needles to a yacht lying out to sea that selfsame night, and that the gentleman in question never turned up. What followed gave these 2 circumstances an appalling significance. For when the body was carried to the mortuary and its clothing searched for possible clues to identification, there was found upon it a sealed packet addressed simply A. Steinmüller, Königstrasse 8, and inside that packet There were 2 unmounted photographs of the exterior of Blockhouse Fort and the Southsea Fort, a more or less accurate ground plan drawing of the interior of the Portsmouth Dockyard, together with certain secret information relative to supplies and to the proposed armament of cruisers now undergoing alteration and re-equipment. The wrath and amazement engendered by that discovery, however, were as nothing compared with the one which so swiftly followed. Brought up before the Admiral Superintendent and the Board, John Beachman, the dockmaster, who alone knew these things outside of the Admiralty, was obliged to admit that one person, and one only, his eldest son, was in a position to obtain admission to the safe in which he kept his private papers, and that son was engaged to a young lady whom he had met during a holiday tour on the Continent. English or foreign, he was asked, to which he replied that she was English, or at least English by birth, although her late father was a German. He had become naturalized before his death, and was wholly in sympathy with the country of his adoption. He did not die in it, however. Circumstances had caused him to visit the United States, and he had been killed in one of the horrible railway disasters for which that country was famous. It was because the daughter was thus left orphaned, and was so soon to become the wife of their son, that he and Mrs. Beachman had taken her into their home in advance of the marriage. They did not think it right that she should be left to live alone and unprotected, considering what she was so soon to become to them, so they had taken her into the home, and their son had arranged to sleep at an hotel in Portsmouth pending the date of the wedding. The lady's name was Hillman, Miss Greta Hillman. She was of extremely good family, and quite well to do in her own right. She had never been to Germany since the date of the engagement. She had relatives there, however, one in particular, a Baron von Ziegelmundt, and his son Axel. The son had visited England twice, once many months back, and the last time some 7 or 8 weeks ago. They liked him very much, the bridegroom-elect especially so. They had become very great friends indeed. No, Axel von Ziegelmundt was no longer in England. He had left it something like a month ago. He was on a pleasure trip round the world, he had heard, but had no idea where he had gone when he left Portsmouth. 2 hours after this statement was made, if the populace could have got hold of young Harry Beachman, it would have torn him to pieces, for it was then discovered that the drowned man was no less a person than this Herr Axel von Ziegelmundt, and that they had not only spent the greater part of that particular day shut up in the former's room in the Portsmouth Hotel, but had been together up to the very moment when the excursion steamer had started on its moonlight trip to Alum Bay, and to the bringing about of that providential accident which had prevented the state affairs of an unsuspecting nation from being betrayed to a secret foe. What followed was, in the face of this, of course, but natural. John Beachman was suspended immediately, and his son's arrest ordered. It served no purpose that he denied indignantly the charge of being a traitor, and swore by every sacred thing that the hours spent in his room at the hotel were passed in endeavouring to master the intricacies of the difficult German card game Skat, and that never in all their acquaintance had one word touching upon the country or the country's affairs passed between Axel von Ziegelmundt and himself, so help him God. It was in vain also that Greta Hillman, shouting hysterically her belief in him, and begging wildly that if he must be put into prison she might be taken with him, and murdered when you murder him if he is to be court-martialled and shot, you wretched blunderers, It was in vain that Greta Hilmann clung to him and fought with all her woman's strength to keep the guard from laying hands upon him or to tear her from his side. The outraged country demanded him, and took him in spite of all. Nor did it turn the current of sympathy in his direction that, crazed when they tore him from her, this frantic creature had gone from swoon to swoon until her senses left her entirely, and the end was tragedy. The full details were never forthcoming. The bare facts were that she was carried back to Beachman's house in a state of hysteria bordering close upon insanity, and that when, under orders from the Admiralty, that house and all its contents were impounded pending the fullest inquiry into the dockmaster's books and accounts, the Admiral Superintendent and the appointed auditor entered into possession, her condition was found to be so serious that it was decided not to insist upon her removal for a day or two at least. A nurse was procured from the Naval Hospital and put in charge of her. But at some period during the fourth night of that nurse's attendance, and when she, worn out by constant watching, slept in her chair, the half-delirious patient arose, and, leaving a note to say that life had lost all its brightness for her, and if they cared to find her they might look for her in the sea, vanished entirely. She could scarcely have hit upon a worse thing for the evil repute of her lover's name or her own. For those who had never known her personally were quick to assert that this was proof enough of how the thing had been managed. In short, that she, too, was a spy, and that she had adopted this subterfuge to get back to Germany before the scent grew hot and the law could lay a hand upon her. Those who had known her took a more merciful view, so far as she was concerned, but one which made things look all the blacker for her lover. What could her desperation and her utter giving up all hope, even before the man was put on trial, mean, if it was not that she knew he was guilty, knew he would never get off with his life, and that her suicide was a tacit admission of this? End of section 18.